So I'd like to begin, if you're okay with it, with a listener submitted question.
Okay.
This actually comes from Tara, uh, Tara Wright, and she says that she is in the crime prevention space as well. That's a space that she works in. And Tara wants to know, after every school shooting, I hear people say nobody saw it coming, but there are always reports that people did see warning signs and didn't say anything, or said something and nothing happened. So, what's the actual breakdown? Is it a perception problem, a reporting problem, or a system problem?
It's it's the question that I had as well when I started this whole business and this whole journey, and started my company TVTP Solutions, because of that exact thing. Was that there was this weird counter narrative that I was hearing where the framing of it was there was a random act of violence, and yet as more and more information came out about the perpetrator, you started seeing that, oh, they had a long history of behavioral problems at school or at work, or they had family issues, or they had touch points with mental and public health programs and entities. They may have had some touch points with law enforcement and things like that, and so that didn't didn't mesh. That narrative didn't mesh with what I was hearing, and found out that that's exactly the case. That they don't mesh. And in fact, one of my big things that I talk to audiences about is that there is no such thing as a random act of violence, and if you frame it as such, then you tend to put your audience or the general public into a more protective and preparedness slash response mindset. Right. So, okay, if you don't know where any of these attacks are coming, you don't know who's going to perpetrate them. Yes, by all means, put as many layers of protection as you can between me and them. Prepare for when they eventually do attack. We'll hope and cross our fingers that nothing will happen, but by all means, continue doing your head down drills or your active shooter drills and all of these different things. Put as many police forces or security personnel on campus. And so that you can see how the public begins to sort of this uneven weighted balance of value ends up transpiring because you sort of frame it as such. But as my research, or not my research, but as more and more research has come out, it is shown that there is a actual pathway to violence. There are stages in which every individual, irregardless of motivation, kind of moves through this sort of pathway up into the point where they have an attack. And that woman's question is absolutely right. Like, there are people within the town with neighbors, there are family members, there are classmates, there are coworkers, there are actual professionals that have had touch points with this individual of a concerning nature. But for whatever reason, my belief is that the reason is that the systems that we have put in place operate on a threshold sort of methodology where an individual has to cross over sort of a certain amount of criteria in order for a response to sort of take hold. Okay. And so what ends up happening is that you don't really have a reporting problem. We have an entire generation that has sort of grown up on the see something, say something campaign, which from a marketing standpoint is probably one of the best marketing campaigns that has ever existed. See something, see what? I don't know, but you kind of do know what you're looking for. Say something, say what, say to who, doesn't say, but we all kind of understand it. We don't have a reporting problem, all right, as we have shown and as we have known, because these individuals are always known entities. What we have is a coordination problem where all these different pieces of sort of the community all have little slivers of information that they are sort of operating off of, and that information stays within their sort of lane. And so you can see, because we operate on a threshold, you'll go to law enforcement. Well, are they doing anything illegal? No. All right, well, there's not a lot that I can do about that. You go to mental health, They'll say, are they a threat to themselves or others? Well, no, not yet. Well, you're going to get in the back of the line, and then the education sector is very, very skittish about sort of revealing any kind of behavioral problems outside of their sector. They like to sort of keep it in-house. And so you just get these sort of slivers of tidbits of information without being able to really take all those puzzle pieces and meld them all together to get an entire picture. And so that really is this multi-pronged sort of Layton's error that we have kind of created for ourselves, just by the design of the systems, the way in which natural human nature follows different framings and different contexts for our behaviors. And it just kind of melds into a big giant mess.
A mission with purpose to find the missing using the power of social networking and cutting-edge technology. We're military veterans, technologists, scuba divers, and relentless seekers. From deep forests to sunken vehicles, from silence to signal, every clue matters. If you've ever felt the call to stand for something greater, this is your moment. This is the Find Me Project.
Thank you for that. I find that interesting, actually. Lots of questions there, and I'm going to hold off because I want to tackle those, here in just a moment. But I find it really interesting from a technology and data perspective. What you're almost describing is pattern of life recognition, predictive modeling in a way to where, potentially if you take a prevention approach, you could therefore become proactive instead of reactive, and maybe even predict or foresee some of this before it becomes a major issue.
Well, you could, and I think the one of the biggest sort of hiccups when I talk to audiences that are more tech oriented, right, is that they are looking at trying to produce a technological solution to a psychological problem, right? And especially coming at it from sort of a targeted violence, sort of a worst case scenario end product sort of thing, you run the risk of, when I talk about sort of like behavioral threat assessment or something like that, in the same way that random acts of violence pigeonholes people into sort of a certain lane of behavior, so does behavioral threat assessment, right? That you are looking for threatening behavior that you will then try to intervene or intercede in a timely fashion. The problem with doing that, or isolating what you are looking for in terms of threatening behavior, is that oftentimes that does not showcase itself until almost the very end, that people put it all together. You often find individuals that their character arc is made up of a bunch of seemingly one-off, innocuous sort of instances that begin to sort of become unmanageable for them emotionally and psychologically, which creates sort of this magnet effect of other issues that kind of come into play. And so the reason why individuals are known entities, because we were concerned about them, is that we have seen little spikes, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that those spikes are somehow going to be tied to some type of violence or in a threatening manner, right? Because we all have grievances, we all get upset. There might be a bunch of different things that are associated with it. The problem is that we sit on those seemingly one-off innocuous things, right? So the breakup of a boyfriend and a girlfriend, not really threatening behavior. The death of a grandfather, not threatening behavior. Deciding that, leaving the soccer team as a senior, not really a threatening. Retiring from a job that you've had for 30 years, certainly not. But it's like those things in combination create enough disturbances into something that I've kind of metaphorically labeled sort of these three buckets that we all have, which is identity, purpose, and community. The human brain cannot accept not knowing what it is. And so in the absence of not knowing what we are, we'll go to search for things that will fill those sort of metaphorical buckets. Okay. And oftentimes we will look at a person's behavior or things that they are saying, and we will try to sort of combat them because it doesn't fit our certain, political ideology or religious, kind of theories and everything else. What we have to understand is that individuals aren't necessarily attaching so much to the message as much as those three intangibles that they're getting from it, right? And so, from a technology of like, well, let's put this all into a database, run it through some AI and get a probability out of it. One, I think it's redundant because I don't think that it necessarily, the accuracy of it is nebulous to begin with. But I also think that if you are so concerned that you saw a behavior that you are willing to put it into a database, you probably should just take the proactive approach and go and talk to that person to see what they're going through, because that really is more beneficial from a prevention standpoint. And certainly the compounding return on investment is going to be a lot greater than if you plug it into some sort of technological program and it just says, well, yeah, 32% of individuals will have an incident that will be somewhat similar. Well, what does that tell? Like, what am I supposed to do with that information, right? Or that probability? Okay, well, I guess 70 plus percent says that he's not, right? So maybe we don't act on that, or maybe that's not necessarily our lane. So we'll either refer them to go see somebody or we'll just sort of back away from it. And so I think part of being in the prevention space is understanding sort of that we are or accepting that we are really complex, that we don't follow our behaviors don't follow reason and logic all the time, that it's far more emotional, and the like. And so that those things that we sort of see, those anomalies in behavior, are things that we need to sort of act on. We need to trust ourselves. One of the things that I think is interesting when you start looking at this from an anthropological sort of lens is that we are designed through our senses and everything else to pick up abnormalities, whether it be through sight or hearing or taste or anything else. And there's actually a lot of theory behind the reason why water is clear is because of this, that it is an evolutionary defense sort of thing that we have gotten, where we can't see color in water and we can't taste it, because if it was basically like Mountain Dew, it would be really hard to discern whether or not something bad had happened to that water or not. And so because we cannot take in the amount of bandwidth of sort of things that are happening in the world, what we do is we sort of isolate through our senses those abnormal things. And so if somebody's behavior spikes abnormally, whether we hear it, we see it, or we just feel it from the way in which they came into the room, there was just something different going on. That is something that we should act on, rather than trying to create a data point to then provide some sense of probability, certainty, or anything else. We are certain that something was amiss there. Just take that and go with it.
Yeah, I appreciate your perception, and I mean that totally makes sense. I find this so fascinating. I mean, you are just a wealth of knowledge. So, gosh, I'm excited for it. Let me, Robert, if you're okay with it, I'd like to give you a proper introduction.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So Robert Mahoney is a leading expert in behavioral threat assessment and the founder of TVTP Solutions. He specializes in helping communities transition from reactive security to proactive prevention. Through his work, he empowers educators, law enforcement, and mental health professionals to collaborate on identifying the pathway to violence and interrupting it through evidence-based strategies. Robert, I think about most people in security or law enforcement, they end up in a reactive lane. Something happens, now we respond. I'm very much interested to know how you kind of flipped that upside down, and you became very much focused on the prevention aspect of that. Could you share?
Sure. Well, people sort of operate within their lanes, and one of the things in being able in my field, or being responsible for sort of taking the 30,000 foot view of sort of trying to look above and see where those coordination points or coordination gaps are sort of happening. And with individuals in sort of law enforcement, they have protect and serve on the side of their car, right? They don't have prevent and serve. And as you mentioned, we have blessed upon them sort of this responsibility of, when shit hits the fan, we need you to respond. Okay. And if we are worried that something is going to happen, we need you to protect us. Okay. We are not asking them, and how we have defined that role doesn't allow them to look at certain things from a prevention lens, from a long-term lens. They are there to get the call and go forward, or they know a certain event is going to come in, and they will place, in case something happens, their response time will be shorter. The same thing sort of with sort of public health and mental health agencies sort of as well. We kind of define what we want them to do, and therefore they also have a response sort of modality where they have to prioritize the worst cases, the people that are in the crisis now, right? And they only have a limited amount of resources. There's only so many clinicians and stuff like that. So they need to pick and choose who needs help immediately. And that's just the way the system is sort of created. We have not facilitated the system for collaboration. And in doing so, we get more and more frustrated with each of these sort of sectors on sort of their lack of optimization, right? One of the case studies that I use for law enforcement is the case of Connor Betts in Dayton, Ohio. And Connor, the entire shooting lasted little more than like 32 seconds, okay? And Connor went about 100 feet. He shot off about 41 rounds. He killed 9 people and injured, I think it was like 27 or 29. There were 6 to 8 officers already on that street, because he decided to do it sort of early Sunday, late Saturday night, when all the bars were kind of coming out, were letting people out and things like that. So there were cops already present. It's really hard as a law enforcement agency to do better than 32 seconds, right? And yet 9 people lost their lives, 27 people were injured, hundreds of people that were in that area on that night or in the surrounding areas forever changed, right? And so when, again, you sort of go back through Connor's history, so that's on the response side. You go back through Connor's history and you sort of see issues from like 6, 7, 8 years old, right? And all these types of things. But we have designed the police for a certain thing. There's nothing that happened with Connor where the police had reason to arrest him, right? Or anything like that. Same thing with mental health. He was a problem. He kept coming up into people's sort of databases or referrals and things like that, and they would maybe talk to him and listen to what he had to say, but he wasn't like a priority at that moment. And so unfortunately, that's just the way the system is designed. And so you need somebody to kind of hover above, not in a bureaucratic way, but just to understand the context in which the individuals within these systems are sort of operating under. and not to necessarily place blame on the people within their systems, because they are simply doing what they are being kind of told to do. Systems by their nature are extremely rigid, right? There's not a lot of flexibility with systems. Sometimes you will get the odd network effect where there'll be, one person will talk to another person and they'll create a committee or something like that. But those networks between systems are really fragile. So one person retires, or one person gets another job or gets promoted and can't spend enough time, doing the networking, and the whole thing just kind of like falls apart, right? And so one of the things that I try to really do is not to create another layer of system, like that information flows in a sort of bureaucratic way, and then you have sort of these overlords that are sort of dictating what information and what data points are serious and what aren't. But what you're trying to do is integrate the coordination within the system, trying to sort of merge these in a way where there's not, they're all part of the pie. They all have a seat at the table, right? And they're sharing their tidbits that they have. And the more tidbits that you are gathering, you can get a better sense of who these people are. I have seen school districts have individuals that will tell you that this person is a huge problem, suspended numerous times, always getting into fights, right? They do not have those behavioral problems at like the Department of Rec basketball game, right? Where they are a mentor to young kids and they want to be into coaching. And actually, there aren't a lot of people outside of school that think this person is really that bad, right? And so you get a okay, so maybe it's not the person, it's the environment that we're sort of in. Maybe you have an individual where their home life is terrible and the cops keep calling, but at school they're a dream, right? Because they're focused and they're right. You need that holistic character view, because you are going to try and apply resources without the whole picture. And so one of the things that I've sort of seen, especially in examining more of the public health sort of programs, state programs and things like that, social welfare programs and things like that, is that they just layer on top of it, or they become hyper specific as to what their role is, to the point where they almost narrow themselves to the point where they're only helping just a small sliver of the population. I've worked with public health entities that could give you, and with analytics, they could tell you if you're a first time, let's say, recipient of food stamps, they could tell you from the month, week, and day that you're going to come back and apply for housing assistance, right? But my system and my lane is just to give you those food stamps, not to connect you with the housing people, right? And the housing people are not necessarily dipping into the bucket for the food insecurity, because it's just not it's like apples and oranges, right? Like what benefit are we've designed this thing to try and get people into housing as quickly as possible. That's a big enough job. We're not making these connections. But you can see it, what that does is that shifts the responsibility onto the person in crisis to sort of manage their own crises when they're just trying to get through the day. They're either trying to get food on the table, or they're trying to keep their job, or they're trying to find a new place so that they're not living out of their car. And these are the types of things, these are the types of situations where, from a violence prevention standpoint, we're looking at this and we're like, well, where's the shooter coming from, right? Well, yeah, none of these in isolation is going to, let's say, probability of violence, but it has, if you do not treat it, if you let it fester, yeah, that individual is going to eventually feel helpless and become potentially suicidal, or potentially even more angry, that they then feel as though violence is really their only expression of help. And you do see individuals that, partners and things like that of mine who have done successful sort of intercessions and interruptions and things like that will tell you sort of that they had a lot more going on that wasn't related to violence, that had we just nipped that sort of in the butt earlier on, this whole process may have been sort of thwarted a lot earlier, with a lot less resources, a lot less time, and the individual would have been a lot happier than the amount of time that they have spent sort of fueling this anger and everything else, and having it sort of mature itself into sort of violent ideation.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And, just hearing you talk about this, I mean, you're clearly an expert. I'm curious, could you walk me through your background before you started TVTP Solutions?
So I started actually kind of in 2005. I was watching sort of Hurricane Katrina footage, and I graduated from college about a year before and didn't really have much, knowledge of where I was going to land. And I remember sort of seeing during Katrina the evacuations and hearing that people were staying in New Orleans and the surrounding areas because there hadn't been any pet evacuation measures sort of planned out. And I wasn't a huge pet person. I'm more of a pet person now because I have 2 puppies. But I thought that was such, even as a non-pet person, I thought that was such an egregious sort of like misstep. Like you don't have any like pet people in all of FEMA. And so I dabbled in sort of emergency management. And I started working at a county emergency management office, and just to test it out, see if I liked it and everything. And what I ended up sort of falling in love with was this cascading problem issue that emergency managers kind of always have, where, hey, we need to do this. All right, we'll do that. And then that trickling into like 3 other problems that you haven't thought of. And then, okay, we're going to try and solve these. And then something back, causes something that you didn't see. And I found that really, really interesting because it sort of played into, okay, let's think of creative ways of how to do things. And so I started sort of working my way up into doing different types of emergency plans and working with locals and state partners and in FEMA and things like that on a variety of different sort of regional plans and state plans and things like that. And then as I sort of progressed, I sort of started seeing, as we all have, sort of like this more prevalence of targeted violence and school shootings and people with different political and religious motivations doing these horrible things. And knowing my emergency management background, in which I ended up getting a master's degree in emergency and disaster management, knowing how much coordination has to be done from an emergency management standpoint, where you're bringing in sort of the sanitation guy and people from public works and the roads people and engineers and everything else. And you're all trying to come up, and the weather people, and you're trying to get all these different informations and expertise to sort of create a picture of what you're kind of going to be dealing with in an emergency. I felt like something was definitely lacking, in the same way that the narratives just weren't matching up. There seemed to be this coordination gap. And so I started delving more into this realm and realizing, as I sort of mentioned, like we don't have a reporting problem, we have a coordination problem. And so when I realized that, I was like, oh, wow, like I can do this, right? And so that's been my sort of real push into this field. It's gotten, I approached it from a coordination. I've now come more full circle on it to see it more as, I've gotten more into the psychology of it, more into the behavioral science portions of it, more into the architectural and interior design, if we really want to go that nerdy and deep into it, and seeing it really in its complete full spectrum totality, rather than looking at it from just a mental health perspective or a law enforcement perspective or even a coordination perspective. It's kind of it's branched out pretty wide.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing the origin story. So it's actually interesting. I didn't realize that you had the background in crisis. What I'm going to loosely just categorize as crisis incident management. That's a lot of my background as well. I'd actually be interested, but not talk about it now. I'll talk offline. But I did it's a professional program at MIT within their crisis management and resiliency program. A lot of folks that have the exact background that you're talking about that would really benefit from this. Who I'd be interested, as you do your advocacy, if we could ever plug you into, you know, presenting to those folks, those students, those professionals that are going through that. Yeah, so we'll have to connect, offline about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. Now, I want to talk about institutional failure for a moment. Let's say you walk into a school district. They've got their active shooter plan. They have cameras on every door. They've gone through the drills. They feel good, right? On paper, they at least feel really good and comfortable. What do you tell them?
So I asked them, that's great. But I also asked them, like, what do you want this school to be? Like, what is the narrative, or what is the story that you want your staff to have of this building? What is the narrative you want these students to have of this building, right? And they often will say things like, we want to be very inclusive. We want to have them feel safe. We want this to be a refuge. We want this to be a learning environment. And okay, excellent. Are the measures that you are putting in line with that narrative? I often share an experience that I had where I was walking into a liquor store, and I saw, as I approached the liquor store, I saw like the outside cameras. I saw some bars on the windows, and I get up there, and there's a huge light that's right by the door. I open the door, I get the ding dong. I walk in, there's like a holding little pen area. I have to go through a metal detector. I get wanded by this huge guy that also has a gun. I'm finally in the liquor store, and it's floor to ceiling bulletproof glass. I've got TVs all behind that glass, watching myself in the store, watching what's going on outside the store, along with like the products. And then I've got to do all my commerce through a drawer. And I remember in that moment having this sort of epiphany of like, this is the safest building I've ever been in. And yet I've never been more scared in my entire life, because the narrative wasn't, oh, look at all these safety security procedures and systems and everything else. Aren't I in a safe place? The narrative was like, what the F goes on in here that they felt it necessary to put all of these things in here? And I never went back, obviously. Like, why would you ever go back to that store if like you're looking for a 6-pack of beer and you feel like you went into like San Quentin, right? Like it's terrifying. And so with schools, I think there again, when it's all about context. Like we have framed it as these random acts of violence that are being done at school, right? Those are the ones that get the most headlines, because even though your probability of being in a school shooting is extremely low, the high consequence of that incident is going to trump everything, because of the feeling that, again, you frame it as random. It's all at school. It's our kids, right? It's terrifying. So by all means, put as many protection and do as much response as you possibly can. The narrative, though, has a counter effect in the same way that the liquor store had. Like, you are terrifying students. you're terrifying staff. I see this all the time when I start talking to SROs or school resource officers and things like that, because they have a narrative of what they are. They look at themselves, yes, as security, but also as an extension of the guidance counselors, right? As sort of the one trusted adult that's roaming the halls, trying to make friends with the kids and trying to gather information from staff and make the staff feel protected and everything else. Yeah, that's not the narrative that they have of you, right? Whether or not you are in your sort of officer uniform with security or just in plain clothes, or if you have a weapon on you, the context of what you are and how I interact with you completely changes, and the narrative. And so with schools, that's one of the big things that I sort of see is this disconnect of narratives of what they want the school to sort of be, and the protection that they put and the response measures that they put in that is counter to that. And what I try to explain to them is I've come up with this sort of thing called Zen security. And I've come up with this haiku of, as a security professional, you want to make the water as still as possible so that you can see what's causing the ripple. And by putting all of that noise, so the security measures and response measures and having that framing of random acts of violence, what you are doing is basically creating this sort of ripple effect within the water that makes it very, very difficult to find those subtle ripples that you're actually supposed to be sort of looking out for. And so what I try to teach them is that it's not that there isn't value to having a plan in case of an attack, or to have policies around locked doors, and maybe having an SRO on the outside of the campus or even on the inside of the campus, but to make sure that all of the narratives around those things are all going in the same direction, and that within the school you are trying to promote more prevention, where you are trying to make that water as still as possible. And so that, going back to like our sort of anthropological stuff, you're able to see those abnormalities a lot easier, right? And in schools, I'll start with the question like, all right, you tell me the quiet kid in the corner that's not a problem, or the quiet kid in the corner who's in the depths of isolation and is being radicalized and just isn't saying anything. Like, you tell me the difference, because I don't know. And so because there's so much noise, I think, within the environment of the school, we will naturally, the staff and students and everybody else naturally focuses in on what's happening right in front of their face. And they're not able to take a look at those more subtle ripples because they have to focus in on the big thing that's kind of like in the here and now.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the haiku. I made a little note here as you were talking to my team to go ahead and make sure we pull that out. And I want to quote that when we do the show notes. I love little call outs like that. I think that's really good. I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, you obviously said it much better than I could ever say it, but that's exactly what I always see, especially as a parent, right? Like, I have 2 kids that are in school. So my number one concern is everything you just talked through. But, back when, I got out of tactical operations, I had a buddy that kind of brought me in a little bit, and we would do risk and threat assessments at various locations, lots of banks, lots of schools. And when we would go to the schools, this was kind of the height of if you remember, the mass violence. You had a lot of school shootings, lots of things happening at once, at least that were making the media. And you're exactly right. We would go to these schools and, they were set up like Fort Knox. I mean, they had some of them even had a man trap to where, if you presented a threat, you would be stuck in this little bubble, all good stuff. But when you look at the actual incidents that are breaking down, it's processes are failing. And most importantly, prevention, it fails every single time. When you actually look at it, you do case studies, you do research, it's always breaking down there.
Yeah, and it's kind of goes to you're absolutely right. Like those one-off incidents, so those incidents that I mentioned earlier of sort of like, oh, I don't like the coach anymore, or and so I quit the soccer team. My grandfather died. I broke up with my girlfriend or boyfriend. Or like, why would I go to an SRO to chat them up about those things? Like, what are they going to do? Like, why would I go and talk to somebody whose entire purpose in my mind is to be there in case shit hits the fan, and you're going to take out that attacker before that attacker attacks me? Why do you need to know about my love life or that grandfather and what he meant to me and everything else? And so, again, it just, the narrative thing, especially in schools, is such an interesting dynamic because, it's, you're almost, I mentioned sort of the idea of latent error. Like you are really kind of creating problems just by in the way you're designing them. You're creating more noise, you're creating more fear, you're creating less avenues for those sort of irritants, those sort of grievances to be brought to the surface and then handled, because it's not of a threatening nature. Or if it does get to that point, we have people on staff who's responsible for it. So I don't have to act right now because I'm just responsible for this period or this one classroom or whatever. And that's it. Also, schools are notorious now for being sort of behavioral threat assessment teams sort of being dumped on them by the state, right? And so now they have this added responsibility of being the nucleus of this behavioral threat assessment team, of bringing in, mental health or law enforcement, and being the coordinating body in the middle, which they're not trained to do. This isn't what they signed up to do. They've got enough on their plate. And you start getting stats in these towns where they have sort of like instituted these behavioral threat assessments, with the school being sort of at the epicenter of it, of like 98% of all the violent threats within the town are 18 and under. Well, I mean, children aren't our future anymore. They're the problem, right? Like, it's not an accurate, nobody can look at that and say like that's an accurate depiction of what's going on in the overall town. So there has, over the last few years, been this effort by certain municipalities to try and extract those out of the schools, where the school is a component of, but not the nucleus of, the threat assessment teams, because it's easier for somebody sort of like me, or somebody in a position like me from a 30,000 foot view, to hold different meetings, or to have coordination calls, or to be able to share information between the different components, to get a better sense of what's going on with this individual.
Yeah.
And it frees up a lot of time and effort for them to do the job that they're designed to do. And I think especially law enforcement really likes this approach, because they keep getting sent to mental health calls, or they get sent, they're the responsibility for following up with this individual, or they, right? And this individual isn't doing anything illegal, and yet here they are kind of being a case manager for this individual, in something that they don't necessarily have any expertise in doing.
Yeah, I mean, again, I want to, just go back. You are clearly an expert. Like I spoke on, my biggest fear as a parent of two with kids that are going to public school is not being able to take care of them, right? Not being able to protect them because the processes and preventables are not in place. So, when I talk to my wife, whenever we have an incident at our school, and I talk, man, things need to change. You are the change. I mean, you and your company, you are the change. So, I'm curious right now, if someone's listening who, let's say runs a school district, maybe they even run a mid-sized company, a city, a village, whatever it may be, what does it actually look like to bring you in?
So they can just, it's a lot simpler than probably people think. You just go to the website, TVTP Solutions.com. There's a contact page in there. We'll set up a meeting and you can basically tell me and my team, what it is that you're trying to do. We have consulting services that range just from sort of basic training of just kind of getting people on the bus with, we're going to go to a more prevention focused approach, or we're going to balance things out, right, between our protection response, and we're going to really put a little bit more value into our prevention measures. But we need everybody to kind of be on board. We can do that. We can go as deep into that training as possible if you want to go through the whole process of the pathway of violence. If you want to go into why we don't call it interventions, we call it sort of negotiations or intercessions. We got all that depth of knowledge that we can go with you from the training. So we're good there. From a consultancy's perspective, we can do a number of different things. We can look at what you have. Okay, you've got a response plan. You've got all these types of lists and checklists and everything else. Okay, how much of that is focused towards prevention? We can instill sort of a sense of behavioral threat assessment ideology. We're pretty agnostic in terms of what actual behavioral threat assessment system you want to adopt, but we can preach the importance of having a behavioral threat assessment team there. And then we can also go a little bit larger in sort of beginning to develop sort of our coordination and that integration of work, where if you are a municipality or a school district and you're worried that you're going to get all this knowledge, but as soon as you leave, it's going to just wash away, then what we will do is we will begin to work with you to just develop business processes that are just integrated. Like, this is just the way you do business in the town and stuff like that, so that whatever the next town mayor or town manager or principal or superintendent or anything like that come in, that it's just seamless. Like, now, like you can do some of this stuff, or she can do some of this stuff, but like this is just how we operate. And so that's probably it. We'll just judge basically like level of work and everything else and based upon your end goals of what it is that you're actually trying to get out of us. And then we'll work from there on developing sort of a program for you.
Sounds good. And you provide your services all across the United States?
Yes, all across the United States. Virtual if need be, and or in person.
Awesome. Well, again, I am semi plugged in, right? To certain people, and I am going to advocate you and your company in every single way possible. Because again, what you do matters, and I think it would make a big difference. So for anybody listening, we're going to put the link to Robert's company's website. So be sure to go over and take a look at that. I do want to say it out loud. That is tvtpsolutions.com. You can head on over there, book a training, hire consulting, or just get educated on what real prevention actually looks like. Robert, I could honestly, talking to you, I could probably, kick this for at least 2 to 3 hours. I do want to try to, keep these episodes anywhere between 30 and 45 minutes. So, who knows, maybe there's an opportunity to have you back on, or to maybe even get you in person if, we're looking at maybe doing some university talks. So maybe to even get you in person, whatever it takes to drive your mission and purpose forward. But I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and consider me totally on board for any of those opportunities. I've considered it a privilege. It's been a privilege to be on the show, and hopefully, if you want me to come back, I'll be happy to do that too.